Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another edition of Mr. American's Moments in Geography. We're going to continue looking at Latin America today, and in particular, our focus is going to be on the Caribbean, or the Caribbean, whichever you prefer. We're going to talk about the physical geography, we'll get into the economics, we'll also certainly get into some of the brief history, and then certainly also get into some of the culture. And so you'll notice when it comes to certainly the geography here, you've got your Greater Antilles located here, your Lesser Antilles, certainly the Bahamas, and we're talking about most of it being certainly south of this line of the Tropic of Cancer. So what are we going to be able to do today? We're going to be able to identify and describe the political and the physical geography of the Caribbean. We'll talk about the countries, we'll talk about the climate and the landforms, and then we're also going to be able to identify the key resources in the economy of the Caribbean. And like I said, the second half will be more about the history and getting more into the culture. So let's start with what the Caribbean or the Caribbean consists of. So you have the Bahamas, certainly a large chain of islands southeast of, if you're looking for a reference in the United States, that'd be southeast of Florida. Certainly made up of hundreds of islands, um, including some that have histories with the British and the Americans, as well as other nations. Then you have what are called the Greater Antilles. This would include Cuba, Jamaica, Puerto Rico, and the island of Hispaniola, which is now two nations, that of Haiti and the Dominican Republic. You also have the Lesser Antilles, which are made up of a chain or an archipelago of smaller islands in the southeast. We will talk about some of those nations today. So collectively, these nations are sometimes referred to as the West Indies. That dates back to the history of Spanish explorers making their way to this region, thinking they were making their way towards the East Indies. So the name has certainly stuck as a part of that heritage. And they're primarily made up of underwater mountains of two types, certainly volcanic and limestone. So our nations that are mostly made up of the volcanic tend to do better with agriculture, richer soil, more fertile, and the limestone typically produces more of the mining, like materials like bauxite, for example, which we'll talk about in a little bit. So certainly when you think about which one is better for growing things on, that would be your volcanic. So where you do see more agriculture, it's the volcanic mountains that have more success in that part. When it comes to climate, most of the islands of the Caribbean are a tropical savanna climate. So very warm, um, perhaps a little bit sparser vegetation as compared to Central America. But very rarely do you have a day where it gets below 50 degrees Fahrenheit. So it's very ideal for a warm tropical climate. Shifting gears to the economy, we have tourism as kind of our main industry here. People come to the Caribbean for the gorgeous beaches, the warm climate, and certainly the kind of lifestyle, the laid back lifestyle here. But we'll get more into that when we talk about culture. Um, Agriculture is still also certainly very important here. This region was largely colonized by Europeans, including the Spanish and French, because of its potential for growing sugarcane. That continues to be a massive crop grown here. And certainly you'll see these large scale plantation like farms in this region. You're also going to see bananas and coffee and tobacco and certainly other commercial crops. And a lot of those are organized into cooperatives, kind of like what we would call co-ops, in which there are these large scale farms often come together in order to grow these. And then certainly rice and beans are grown here. These are also real key staples of the diet in the Caribbean. There are a few nations that are typically, or islands that are typically more of those limestone mountains that do have some mineral wealth. When we look at Jamaica, they have bauxite, which is featured here in the lower right-hand corner. It's a mineral that's used in the making of aluminum. And then you'll also see Trinidad and Tobago um, have some oil, and they tend to be the most industrialized nation in the Caribbean. So more factory systems than others. Shifting gears, like I mentioned, we're going to do that today when we talk about when we talk about the Caribbean. We're going to look at some of the historical events of this country, of these nations. We're also going to identify some key parts of daily life across the Caribbean. So certainly, you've had native populations living here for centuries. The first contact they have with Europeans comes in the form of Columbus, who reached the Bahamas, and in particular the island of San Salvador in 1492. He then met the Taino, or the Taino, which are the original inhabitants, and through disease and Columbus's actions, this population was nearly decimated. And so certainly there is a little bit of that legacy of racism and some of that more difficult history as a part of this region, just like it would be in any area that has experienced colonization. The Spanish had their first permanent European settlement here about 4 years after Columbus arrived in 1496, and that was in Santo Domingo, which is in the Dominican Republic. This is also an area that was a part of the African slave trade, or the triangular trade, or Atlantic slave trade. All of those referring to the same thing. And for my students, we'll take a kind of a look at a representation, but we're looking at over 15,790 ships making their way and bringing slaves to this region. And that slave trade does bring a lot of African influence to this region, which is certainly added to the really very unique culture that's found in the Caribbean. Many countries achieved their independence, usually between the 1800s and the 1900s, and some, especially in the Lesser Antilles, are still not independent. Nations like Guadeloupe and Martinique are still connected to France, and Puerto Rico is still considered a Commonwealth of the United States. However, when this is being recorded, Puerto Rico had decided to make some changes to its status. We're still waiting to see what those are, whether it could be independence or perhaps statehood. We'll see what the future holds for Puerto Rico. And then all but Cuba are democratic. Cuba is certainly a changing communist state, but certainly strong government control over the economy and the political status of Cuba. And that, of course, begins with the Castros. So switching to daily life, there's a very unique mixture of that Native American population here, African tradition, some kind of mixed African tradition, and then your European ancestry. And when it comes to nations like Haiti, about 95% of the population has that African ancestry. Haiti actually has a very cool history of independence with a slave revolt and eventually an independence from France. This is also, these are very Christian nations. They're predominantly Catholic, but you'll certainly see some Protestant tradition brought in with the British. And it's pretty urban. About 60% of the population finds itself living in these cities. It also has an extremely unique musical heritage. In Jamaica, you'll find reggae, which is kind of this really cool combination of African rhythm and even some popular American music, and certainly has been made very popular with people like Bob Marley or Ziggy Marley, son for that matter. Trinidad and Tobago, again, the more industrial, you'll see of the nations, you'll see steel drums, and throughout the Caribbean, you'll see salsa music. Soccer and baseball, much like in Central America, are your most popular sports. Um, Certainly, a ton of very famous MLB baseball players have come from the Caribbean. And that's kind of where we're going to wrap things up, ladies and gentlemen. So, for my students, make sure that you're following along with your guided notes. Take the opportunity here to kind of do the check-in quiz. Just make sure you pick up on some of it. For those of you who are just listening, thank you so much. I really do appreciate you taking the time to listen. And hopefully, like I said, maybe we're adding a little bit to your understanding of this great and fantastic world we live in. So that's going to do it for this edition of Mr. Merrigan's Moments in Geography. And we'll see you next time.